everyone. I'm very happy on behalf of the Dialogue of Civilization Institute to welcome you in this webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on religious and faith community. I would like also to express a special thanks to the guest speakers and our partners, namely the Guerrand-Hermes Foundation for Peace, CAICID, Georgetown University, and United Religious International. We are extremely pleased to organize this webinar today, and I will hand over very quickly to Scherto Gill, who will be moderating this session. I just would like, for those of you who are not familiar with the Dialogue of Civilization Institute, to say just a few words about the organization. DOC is a Berlin-based international think tank, and we like to portray ourselves as the first ever multilateral think tank. In other words, it means as a multilateral organization that we are not here to promote, like many other think tanks, the views and perspective of one country or one school of thoughts, but we are first and foremost here to provide a global platform of dialogue, bringing together the multiple perspective, the multiple culture, the multiple civilization, to promote dialogue among them, with the goal to foster the emergence of shared worldviews. And of course, sharing those worldviews in taking into account the respective culture, the respective civilization. In that respect, of course, religion is a very important topic in a DOC agenda, and my colleagues will very briefly tell you later on a few words about the programs that Dialogue of Civilization Institute is developing in the field of religion and interfaith dialogue. But for now, I immediately hand over to Scherto Gill, not without saying a very important thing in terms of instruction. If you want to ask questions or if you want to make comments, because we will devote as much time as possible for an interactive discussion, you click on your screen and you will see at the bottom of the screen, you have a Q&A function. So as of now, really as of now, immediately, you can click on the Q&A function, and then you can ask your question or you can make comments and remarks. Scherto Gill, who will be moderating the discussion, will be collecting, eventually clusterizing your question. So the sooner you put forward your question, the better. So we will remind you that later on, but keep in mind that if you want to make comments, you go on Q&A and you can, as of now, put forward your question. Thank you, and I immediately hand over to Scherto and thank her, for taking the responsibility of moderating this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe, and a warmest welcome to all of you to this seminar. Before launching to the conversation and the partners of the webinar, together with our panelists, we would like to express our solidarity and empathy for those who are traumatized by the COVID-19 pandemic, and those who are in mourning for the victims and all in fear of losing relatives and friends. We share our deep concerns about the loss, physical distancing, alienation from spaces and rituals that would otherwise provide comfort at such time. And of course, our gratitude goes to the DOC's organizing team for bringing forth such an important webinar. We look forward to hearing more, JC, about the DOC's your own work. For today's conversation, I'm most honored to be introducing three extraordinary speakers, not only in anticipation of what they would share on the topic of this webinar, but also in full hope to witness the dialogue amongst them. This is because each of our speakers is simultaneously scholar a researcher, an activist, and a facilitator of dialogue, with many years of experience amongst them as leaders of interreligious dialogue organizations or as pioneers of the interfaith movement. First, we welcome Katherine Marshall, a professor of practice at Georgetown University and executive director of the World Faith Development Dialogue, an organization that focuses on the intersection between development and religion. Next, we welcome Professor Patrice Brodeur, who works at the Institute of Religious Studies, University of Montreal, and also is the senior advisor at CAICID International Dialogue Center in Vienna. Amongst Patrice's many achievements, I would like to mention the research that he led that has resulted in an interactive peace map illustrating the work of over 500 organizations who have advanced interreligious interfaith dialogue globally. And thirdly, we welcome Victor Kazanjian, the Executive Director of United Religions Initiative, or URI, a global grassroots interfaith peace-building network. Its interfaith cooperation circles are active in 180 countries around the globe. Prior to that, for 20 years, Victor was the Dean of Intercultural Education and Professor of Peace and Justice Studies at Wellesley College. Well, my friends, to start you off, I want just to mention a 2018 Guardian article, which suggests that over 80% of the global population either identifies with or adheres to a religious or faith group. So to suggest that the current pandemic affects religious and faith communities as if they are separate from the rest of the world, the rest of us, seem to be a mistake. However, the questions remain. How do COVID-19 impact on these communities? What challenge do they encounter? Are these challenges unique to these communities? Well, just briefly, as we already heard, there are two sides of the story. On the one hand, is the concern, especially at the early phase of the pandemic, about the risk of a certain religious ways of life that may exacerbate the spread of the infection. And on the other hand, we have also seen the unprecedented ways that the religions are innovating, adapting, and transforming their practice in providing the multifaceted support to the vulnerable, to the needy, and including spiritual care to all. So for the first round, Victor, would you like to start? As URI works in more than 100 countries around the globe, you yourself have also brought religious leaders and practitioners online together to explore similar questions. What have you learned so far?
Thank you so much, Scherto. And it's lovely to be here, and thank you to DOC for gathering us, and also just to be with dear friends, Katherine and Patrice, and also new friends, Scherto and Jean-Christophe. So I want to say a few words about the challenges that we have seen and also what we're learning from this in the faith-based communities, among people of beliefs, different beliefs and worldviews, and also in the interfaith world. And I think amidst the suffering and the strain and the ways in which society is being pulled and frayed in so many ways, I also have the extraordinary opportunity daily to see in communities around the world how people are responding to one another with open hearts, with their expression of their beliefs into action, of loving the neighbor, of caring for each other. And so I think I want to start by just affirming that as we dive deeply into the challenges and the disruption and the pain that we see, I also want to say that those who are comforting the suffering and feeding the hungry and praying for those who are struggling and promoting good health practices and advocating for the vulnerable and confronting those who would seek to divide one from another through prejudice. but perhaps most importantly, religious communities, belief communities, spiritual communities, indigenous communities, are reaching out to those who are in isolation. And I think it is the isolation, not only the physical isolation, but the fear that leads to emotional isolation that has been so deeply troubling and so complicated. So let me mention a few challenges and then a few opportunities, and then pass to my colleagues to go deep into these areas. So there's no doubt that in the beginning, the disruption of patterns of behavior, of ritual, of gathering around life moments of birth and death, around weekly gathering for people of religious faith, was a disruption in those patterns, and in some sense has raised the question, is religion about place or about practice? Is it about a physical building that people come to and gather communally, or is it something beyond that, that one expression of which is that place of gathering? And I think religions and religious institutions are wrestling with that. How do they engage when so much of their practice has been a practice of communal gathering? And there's a whole discourse happening around rights versus responsibilities, around what do religious communities, what are their responsibilities to the whole, at the same time as they want to gather people in their spaces, which can become major health risk, are major health risks. The thing that I've been focusing on mostly is the strain in the social bonds, the ways in which this time of disruption in our lives has opened the door to fears, to prejudices, to the othering of folks who are different from oneself, often encouraged by those with supremacist worldviews, often deepened by the very real issues of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, the ways in which in indigenous communities are targeted once again, their lands being taken away, the ways in which people are using this moment, those who seek power, to divide in an attempt to rule or to increase power. And into that situation of strained social bonds emerges many in the interfaith world and in the religious communities, where the connection with each other, the deep ways in which we are connected one to another, heart to heart, soul to soul, the ways in which all religions at their root speak of a spiritual connectedness that is beyond race, gender, caste, class, nationality, or even faith. And so there is this moment when, although there are some who use religion as a way to others, that has historically always been the case in that exclusivist worldview of I know the only truth. But at its best, I think religion and interfaith communities, the interfaith perspective that bring people of all faiths together in dialogue, are speaking directly into this moment of the divisiveness, the division that happens, and confronting those who would use that to diminish, dehumanize the lives of others. So that to me is a major piece of what we're seeing right now, and it is in many ways the onus is on the religious communities and the interfaith communities to step strongly into the breach and to confront those who would erode the social cohesion, the social contracts that are essential for diverse societies to exist. So that, and on the ground, I think incidents of hate, prejudice, violence have increased. We've seen that, no question about it. In addition to just expressing that deep religious sentiment of love of neighbor, the golden rule philosophy that exists in all belief systems, it is also important that religions examine their own exclusivist tendencies, and even liberal religions carry remnants of their own kind of exclusivist past. And so that's an issue that I think we're confronting as the world struggles with this. But a couple of opportunities. In the interfaith world, those of us who live in the in-between spaces, between communities, and invite communities into encounter with each other, into dialogue, to deepen understanding, I think what we're seeing is how important this work is to be carried out over a long period of time so that relationships are built, strong relationships are built between people of different beliefs, so that in times of stress, those relationships can hold, those bonds can hold. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing in the success of interfaith work over the years, which often happens under the radar, sort of behind the scenes quietly, is in moments of great stress and strain, those bonds are strong for most and are crucial, because it is those spaces that say, as we retreat into the corners of our own lives and our own beliefs, we must be called into spaces of engagement once again to remind ourselves that we are connected, that we are one, not only human community, but community connected to this planet, Earth, and how we are interdependent. So just finally, the sense that the pandemic has transcended all faith boundaries, national boundaries, that it jumps species, that we are this sickness that we are encountering also teaches us that there is no separation, there is no separateness in this world between people on bases of any identity characteristic, and there is no separateness really between the human world and the natural environment, that we are interconnected and that we are called, not only because of the pandemic, but because of the climate crisis and because of the population crisis and because of the food crisis, we are called into a space of honoring that interconnectedness and moving towards ways which I know Katherine and Patrice will dive into in more depth, of how we take this moment to create a new normal, a new way of being together, not slipping back into patterns of political, economic, social, religious behavior that perpetuates our separateness.
Thank you very much, Victor. And I'm particularly appreciative of you arriving at the interconnectedness, not amongst the human, also beyond the human, and in terms of our interconnectedness and interdependence with nature, and questions already coming in, particularly wants to explore that further. And I just want to follow Jean-Christophe to remind you, please send your questions and as the conversation goes on, so that I can fold your questions into the conversation. And now I turn to you, Katherine. You've been leading actually a research, faith and COVID-19 research at the World Faith and Development Dialogue. And also you have developed an online resource repository. There's very rich information and ideas being shared. So what could you tell us in terms of the main themes and topic that, in addition to what Victor already shared, that confronting religious and the faith communities, in particular in terms of both their relationship with other sectors of the society, and also amongst the traditions themselves, which actually Victor already hinted at. Over to you, Katherine.
Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this dialogue, which very much is a dialogue. The issue of religion, interestingly, in the COVID pandemic came up very early, and really in quite negative ways, because a number of communities were essentially super spreaders. And I think two problems were revealed through that. One was quite a lot of discussion about the gap between faith and science, which I think is a false dichotomy. And the second, of course, was the difference between the world of faith and the rest of the world, which is also, as Scherto had mentioned in the very beginning, a fallacy. We're talking about interconnected I think that someone once said, everyone has faith. The question is what they have faith in. So this idea that the world is divided into religious and non-religious, I think takes us down several very unconstructive rabbit holes. But I think that based on sort of having been immersed in thinking about the COVID lessons, there are 2 points I want to highlight. The first one is some of the lessons from the past. And then the second is the fact we talk a lot about masks in this crisis, of what this crisis is unmasking about our society and the future directions. So in terms of lessons, if you, as a historian, much of history is shaped by pandemics and other crises that we can be very sure that this will mark for our children and grandchildren, and perhaps beyond, a major turning point in history. So clearly one of the first things people have done is to ask, what are the lessons that have been learned? More recently from HIV/AIDS, from the Ebola crisis, from the Zika crisis, from some others, and looking back at plague and typhoid. Looking particularly at the Ebola in West Africa, 2014, 2015, one frustration is that a lot of the basic lessons about the roles of religious communities have not really been taken into account. They've not really been taken into account by the scientific community in the sense of understanding and appreciating the roles that religious beliefs, practices, etc., play in communities and in health as a long-term objective, not to speak of the actual delivery of healthcare in hospitals and clinics that are run by religious organizations. So I think there's a lot on all of these pandemics that we hope will be learned this time, that there will be much more dialogue. Positively, WHO, the World Health Organization, CDC, and the United States and other bodies are actively reaching out because of the issues of physical distancing, particularly, and some other practices. Ironically, even singing is a means of transmission. And so there has been quite a lot of communication. But I think the area that we want to focus on acutely is on what people call the second or the third crisis, which is the hunger crisis. Some people talk about COVID, the hunger crisis, as people lose their jobs, as families are forced together in ways that are showing spikes in domestic violence against women, against children, the sort of underlying tensions. So there are, the positive side, massive recovery programs that are being designed, but it is not clear how far the wisdom and the direct experience of religious communities is really being taken into account. One comment we hear is that if you're not at the table, you end up on the menu. So the question is, who is going to be at these tables? So the next comment that I'd like to focus on is the unmasking, and what this crisis is revealing in ways that I hope are unmistakable is the horror of the inequalities in the world, the health disparities, what is available to someone in the city where I live, Washington, DC, versus Malawi or Tanzania or Cambodia. There is no justice in the kinds of disparities and in the neglect of so many people who are at the end of the road. So this question of what is unmasked, what happens when the mask comes off and we see the world the way it is. Now, clearly, one of the things that it's making very clear is the links between the environment and human life. On the one hand, you have, I have rabbits jumping around my garden who would never dare to come under normal circumstances. The views, people can see mountains that they've not seen for a long time. So the possibilities of what we can see are being revealed. So I think maybe to end this first comment on this positive note, that the possibility to see more clearly as we sit, for many of us in quarantine or in isolation, we have the possibility to see and to think and to feel, to have the empathy for people. There's a word that people have been using, which is snoblums, which is problems of snobbery, which is people who are bitter and unhappy because they can't go out to restaurants. But I think we need always to keep that in the context of people who are without enough food to live through the next day, who cannot have medical care. Those are the issues that I think are so clearly, so starkly revealed in this crisis, and that point us in future directions. So over to you.
Thank you, Katherine. The concern for structural injustice and structural violence, it is a sort of underlying all the conversations, because as you said, as we put mask on our face as a way of stopping the infection, or the whole pandemic also unmasked the structural injustice. I would like to follow that later, but for now, I don't want to miss an opportunity, Patrice, because as you are here, and as we heard, early there is this kind of tension about spiritual practice, certainly kind of certain religious practice, and that may be in tension with the need for lockdown, for self-isolation and so on. But in the meantime, there is innovation found in many religious communities. So I want to pose this to you. As a scholar of religious studies, but also a scholar of political science and governance, what is your take on this kind of perennial tension between these two aspects? On one hand, is the imperative to sustain the core of religious teaching and practice, without which the religion would lose its connection with the core identity. But on the other hand, is this unstoppable force of a transformation demanded by our time in terms of relationship with each other, with other religion communities, other religions, and also with nature. So what's your take on this?
Thank you, Scherto, and also thank you, Victor and Katherine, for your wonderful words before me. I'd like to address this incredibly challenging question by saying that, in a way, a crisis brings out, as we all know, the best and the worst in people, in communities, in some ways. But I would say more in people than communities. I would say that first, crises bring out possibly the best in communities rather than the worst. And so that's already a distinction that is becoming clear to me. Second, when I look at what I call the exacerbation of the fault lines that are coming out of this crisis, of course, many of the issues that were mentioned already, such as inequalities, economic inequalities, that obviously have a major impact on recognizing how many millions of people don't even have access to clean water, let alone anything else in terms of masks or ventilators to try to help those who are affected. By the way, if my connection is interrupting, it has been doing so already, and I was afraid it might do so. I realize I must speak without moving my head or my hands, which is an amazing challenge for me. because it takes more bandwidth when we move. So I will do my best to be as immobile as possible as I continue. So anyhow, so yes, adaptation is indeed a part of what faith communities are challenged with in this time of crisis, to different degrees in different places, of course, because of ways in which different countries are addressing and are imposing or not isolation, etc., etc. But having said that, I think that the emergence of bunker mentalities is an important element of what frames, in some ways, the responses that we see, both within faith communities, bunker being those who cramp down and consolidate their own faith community in a way that is about handling fear of survival, which is a very profound human instinct. And when that is connected to a particular way of thinking of one's own community as being linked to.
I'm afraid Patrice might have moved. Would you like to begin?
And so these are short breaks, I'm afraid. I've realized this over the last 30 minutes or so. So I will punctuate my presentation, sadly. But I would say that another form of bunker mentality is nationalist discourses. And one of the fault lines that has been exacerbated is the ways in which decision-making about managing the crisis have often been linked almost exclusively to national processes of decision-making. And given that this is a global crisis, the links to the transnational, the international, has often been weaker. And that to me is unsettling, given the need to respond in a transnational way to such a crisis. And one of the ways in which this takes place is exacerbated by particular kinds of media that will, of course, strengthen the news coverage from a nationalist perspective. We have all the statistics repeated daily, several times daily, about national situation and number of people infected, number of people who have unfortunately, sadly died, and those who have also more recently statistics about those who have survived. And so, but that nationalistic kind of news coverage does not help foster a better understanding of the transnational nature of this particular crisis. So these are important elements to take into consideration. And the question, of course, is to what degree do transnational religious communities also possibly fall into the same problem, which is transmitted knowledge more about their own folks, their own adherents than about others worldwide. But now let me move to the second part, which is what I call the increase in silver lines that we can see at this time of crisis. And one of them is definitely, as was mentioned by Victor in particular, the increased cooperation, collaboration amongst people of faith, irrespective of what faith they might be. And that is really an increase, and you can monitor it from an academic perspective, empirical perspective, through simply monitoring the number of international webinars that have taken place that have addressed the question of religion in one way or another. We're talking about hundreds of those seminars, and that to me is a sign of the robust nature that the interfaith or interreligious movement has gained over the last decades. And it is a paradigm shift on a human history perspective to see just how much collaboration across faith lines is now taking place. Then another silver line to me is, of course, the increase of resilience and versatility of so many of the faith communities in adapting the worship to an online sort of, or at least hybrid format, that is important for them to continue what is needed, which is part of the collective worship that often takes place in all religious communities. How this is transformed will vary, of course, on access to the internet. And there again, question of inequality of access needs to be reminded. And when Katherine uses the example of the table, who's invited to the table rather than simply being left to being on the menu, the analogy of the table is in a way partly problematic insofar as it implies people being able to reach the table once invited, or simply they organize a table to be able to invite others. What about those who don't have the means to get there because they're not on the radar screen of anybody? And so that's another form of vulnerability which we see coming out of this crisis in ways which are flagrant and need to be addressed in the future. Let me end my few remarks on how different interfaith initiatives have helped transform the landscape of how we collaborate across faith lines in addressing the crisis primarily and beyond. I would say that definitely there's been an increase in dialogue training online, part of which I've been myself involved in, especially with the World Organization of Scout Movement to promote their peace, their Dialogue for Peace program. And that has meant training young people around the world to understand that in a time of crisis, simply going on with regular weekly scout meetings between members of these different local troops is a way of keeping mental health properly in balance, let alone then how to use that time to talk about how to organize to go out there to do things for the community, which is fantastic and absolutely necessary. I'm reminded of my friend from Togo who simply said, we went out only to discover that we did not have actually hardly any masks available. So we decided we would make the masks and then offer them as part of the educational programs to the community. And of course, this approach may be done in some cases through this scouting being linked in some cases to religious communities. And in many cases, it's beyond. It's either interreligious or beyond any religious identity per se. It is more of a civic engagement on the part of some of the scout troops. So you have different kinds of ways within an organization, in this case, the Scouts, in which they respond to the crisis, sometimes from a religious perspective, sometimes not. Another example, of course, is the way in which if you go online and look at the KCED International Dialogue Center website, there's a dozen webinars on a variety of different aspects that have been done to address this question of religious collaboration to address the crisis. And then there are so many other institutions that have done so. And that, I think, is something important to mention, whether it's Religions for Peace or URI, as was mentioned by Victor before. But the efforts of Katherine at Georgetown in terms of a particular website to monitor what's happening out there is incredibly important. And finally, I would want to end by saying that, as Katherine mentioned about the lessons, who are the people to whom we ask about these lessons that are being learned as we speak? And to what degree are we managing to have a trickle down of those conversations we're having the privilege of doing now to a larger number of people in order to get feedback on the degree to which we are right or wrong maybe about what we think the lessons may be, so as to adapt them, adjust them, and then figure out sort of how they will impact the new normal mentioned by Victor earlier. So I'll end here. And thankfully, my connection held a little better towards the latter part of my presentation. So I look forward to continuing this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrice, and for packing in so many different meaningful insights into this short presentation, although you didn't really answer my question. Well, maybe there'll be later opportunity to address that, because the sustaining traditions and transformation, it remains to be an important question. But clearly from all your presentations, we could see that we're presented with a global crisis, well, maybe two global crises at the same time, where every individual, every person is implicated, and all aspects of human life has been affected. And this also poses an opportunity, as you already indicated, for us to transcend it, not to deny it, not to run away from it, but embrace it. So this rebuild better, and that has to feature structural peace, equality, justice, and the right relationships amongst all. So clearly, three questions that such a future invites. The first one concerns leadership, and especially where are the places of religious leaders in rebuilding the future, but also in joining those kind of transnational global dialogue about our future. Second concerns young people. What do we do in terms of integrating young people in this process? Because they are the future generation. Is it education where we should lay the emphasis? Is it like training that Patrice is doing with Scouts and other interfaith dialogue movement to involve young people in this process? Third one is actually, someone has already put the question, concern how do we reconcile with our past? In a sense, Katherine has already indicated, we can learn a lot from the past in terms of the way we deal with the crisis. But also, Victor, in another occasion, talk about the importance of healing. So if we don't address the current situation, then the current situation will be sedimented and become that kind of a past grievance to be addressed in the future. So three things. One is about leadership. Second, about the youth, young people. The third is about healing. I'd open the floor and to see how you would like to take it forward.
Thank you, Scherto. Those are wonderful challenges for us. Let me just briefly touch on those, starting with the last. In facing our past and facing our present, there's a psychological and sociological phenomenon that I think is crucial for us to reconcile and engage, and that has to do with the process of grief. That in the midst of not only the grief of great losses of life, but also the grief of paths that have changed, lives that has been disrupted, the grief of realizing, as Katherine so eloquently said, the sort of unmasking of the inequities that our world is suffering from. If we do not take up these experiences in part as grief, that energy gets stuck and moves to grievance. That's a psychological phenomenon. It's a sociological phenomenon. It has led to violence as Katherine mentioned, in interpersonal forms like domestic violence. It has led to genocides. It is our inability to deal with and embrace grief as grief, and to go through the processes of that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross so beautifully illustrates in terms of the cycle of grief, that we need to move into the grief, into the sadness, into the emotional worlds of that, hold that together, both in relationship and also societally, so that we can emerge not with a culture of grievance, which is easily manipulated by leaders who use that grievance, but rather a transformed culture of reconciled forgiveness, of an understanding of the vulnerability and the fragility of all people, and that's crucial. Very briefly, one of the things we're discovering in URI is that leadership needs to be redefined as not just those formal leaders who have been commissioned to lead in religious settings or elsewhere, who are powerful and can be prophetic, but that leadership needs to emerge from ordinary people in local communities who are often unseen. And that's what we see. We see this incredible movement of leadership, including young people who are flocking to the interfaith world in unprecedented numbers, because it provides a redefinition of leadership where you don't have to have a formal title in order to carry the wisdom of a community and to enact that. So I think redefining our notions of leadership, especially so that all persons, gender equity and age equity, becomes more how we understand where the wisdom of our communities emerges.
That's really
interesting.
Thank you. Would you like to come in, Katherine?
Okay, I was jumping even before invited. I think that we are at a point where there is a crossroads. And one of the lessons from history about previous pandemics is that often the outcome is not positive, that it accentuates divisions within societies that are even ones that are not even seen, that wars and conflicts, genocides are part of the outcome. So right now what we're hearing is two different narratives. We're hearing one narrative, which is that people are realizing the common bonds of humanity, the interconnectedness, the love, the call of humanity. But at the same time, we're also seeing some of the dark side, what I call the dark angels, of people who are looking for someone to blame, who are out for themselves. And we are, of course, seeing that in leadership as well as in people who are driven by desperation to look for an explanation and find the explanation in some difference. So I think that the question for us all is, how do we reinforce this positive narrative, and not just as societies start to open up, how do we go back to our lives as we knew them, but how do we take this opportunity, this crisis, as an opportunity to rebuild, to reimagine in a society where there is justice, where there is fairness. One thing we haven't mentioned that I think is very important is rethinking education. Rethinking, when schools reopen, is there something that we can really teach our students from kindergarten through graduate education about their common humanity, about their responsibilities, about service, as well, of course, as the basic skills that they need. So I think that these are very important questions. And the question of leadership is an interesting one. And I do want to highlight that in interreligious and in religious circles, women are often not the most prominent. So we have some wonderfully inspirational comments. One of my favorites is Desmond Tutu reading a statement by the Dalai Lama. So you have a lot of very inspirational, insightful comments coming from leadership. You also, of course, have something many people have noticed, which is that women political leaders seem to be doing quite a good job in many societies. And so what that means to me is the sort of obvious that women hold up half the sky, that if you don't have women and men and young people and older people all involved, you have a distorted picture. And so it is something I think that religious institutions more broadly, that we need to have a dialogue about what is the meaning of equality between full equality, genuine, authentic equality between men and women and between young and old. How do we respect the elders who are so threatened in the current crisis at the same time that we value and work with the excitement of the young. So that comes back to this question, which I think in a sense is at the core of everything we're talking about today, which is what kind of process can we be part of, can we contribute to, that will help us to move on the positive path towards a better world, a fairer world, one where people are not forgotten, that everyone, the most forgotten people, the most vulnerable, are genuinely at the center of what we're thinking about. And groups like the Vatican are working on that, the Catholic Church, many other communities are already starting to, but how do we bring this together in a way that can genuinely stop the inevitable tendency to go back the way things were, which is comfortable and easy, but instead look very boldly and creatively towards a different future.
Thank you, Katherine and Victor, for your contribution. Of course, all three questions are hard questions, and leadership seem to be addressed a lot. And Patrice would like to come in, especially in terms of, well, I think both Katherine and Victor had presented to us the importance of redefining leadership. Patrice would like to come in on that.
Yes, because I think that this redefinition of leadership is particularly important in religious communities because we know that if we only look at institutional leadership, then it tends to be almost exclusively male. And yet, if you look at communities in terms of who's doing the work out there and often organizing and leading the work on the ground, well, it's a rather different picture, let's put it this way. And I believe it's very important to redefine this notion of leadership, as was mentioned, but I'd like to link it to policy making and policy makers, because if we think of broadening the notion of policy makers to not just policy in terms of who's elected in a position of decision making in one level of governance or another, from the municipal all the way up to the United Nations, but rather to think of policy making along the lines of common citizenship, both at the local and at the global level. Then we begin to see that leadership and policy making actually go hand in hand. And I believe very strongly that the part of the new directions unfolding within the interfaith movement today is precisely along the lines of these new broadened understanding of leadership to include more women in a fair and equal way, and also to broaden notions of decision-making first within each religious communities, and then secondly, as the joint decision-making needs to take place between the political decision makers and different members or categories of members of civic society, of which religious communities are a rather important piece, more or less, depending on whether a nation or a society is more religious or less so. So that redefinition of leadership linked to redefinition and broadening of policy making, combined to notions of citizenship, I think is a winning triad as we look forward to building together the new normal.
Wow, thank you very much. We don't have too much time left. I want to weave in some of the questions that have been posed. For instance, already mentioned, one is how does interreligious dialogue contribute to the kinds of emergence, global consciousness of the need of the need of stopping the destructive relationship towards nature? This is from our friend Edward, and so this is an important question because it raises a notion of emergent, what you call human consciousness, the consciousness to not seeing as a part of nature, apart from nature, but we are part of nature. And how does interreligious dialogue contribute to that consciousness? And then there's another question from Sharif, and it's looking at, well, how can religious communities actually bury the hatchet of the past and turn our attention to future, a vision for humanity as a whole, and how do interreligious dialogue movement contribute to that? And well, amongst this, there's another question from Laura. Laura suggests that we may have to be, at one side, there's this kind of more nationalistic approach, but on the other side, there's this kind of a collaboration or cooperation across the boundary, religious and faith boundaries. And does that mean that will it entail a re-evaluation of some of the religious teaching and from a theological perspective? Patrice is coming back to that question again. Okay, over to you.
If I may, I also noticed that I think it was Laura who mentioned also the contribution of interreligious, interfaith dialogue to intercivilizational dialogue, and the importance of thinking about interreligious, to me, as a form of multilateral, multi-religious way of thinking about human dynamics. And it is a part and parcel, or ought to be, of a multilateralism focused on transnational frameworks of reference. The two, to me, beautifully complement each other, at least in theory. And I say this simply because I'm aware that in some cases, there are particular ways in which nationalist participation in multilateral spaces of dialogue end up being a participation which is not truly dialogical, because it is in fact a participation to simply protect the interest of the nation first and foremost, rather than one of true openness to learning and to joint decision making about whatever topic is being focused on. And so part of the learning that one learns as an individual in the process of practicing and improving the quality of dialogical skills and competencies in interfaith circles has a direct applications also in intercivilizational dialogue, as well as, of course, intercultural and interconvictional and interspiritual and whatever other forms people have developed to talk about ways in which humans interact in individual and collective ways.
We've, as we've discussed interreligious dialogue over many years, there clearly is the somewhat false dichotomy between a sort of theological coming together of different religious traditions versus interfaith praxis, where people actually come together to solve problems. Hopefully there'll be a combination of the ideas and the action, but just as a final point, I want to emphasize that to me and in my experience, which has been working in very secular organizations, but with the world of religion, I think that the effort to bridge the gulfs between the religious perspectives and the non-religious perspectives, particularly on policies, is more difficult than it is between Buddhists and Hindus, or Muslims and Christians, or Protestants and Catholics. And I think we need to focus very much on getting away from the ideas that I started with, that there's a gulf between faith and science, or between religion and non-religion, believers and non-believers. I think those are very false and unconstructive divides in today's world. But as we're looking at the global recovery efforts, which are going to be the focus for the next 2 years for all of us. We can't plan anything, but we know that there are going to be massive efforts to try to rebuild schools, health, jobs, everything. I think we need to be conscious of trying to get away from these binaries, from these perceptions of divides as well as the real divides, and find ways to have a dialogue and common action together.
I think that's so important, Katherine. And I you know, something you said earlier made me think that we are in a moment of potential consciousness shift and linguistic shift. And I think the world notions of faith or belief as having to do solely with institutional religion is, we have an opportunity to let that fall away and to reclaim the notion that belief, I tend to use belief rather than faith, everyone has beliefs because beliefs inform our worldviews. And our worldviews is something that all human beings have. They're shaped by our personal lives, by our community life, by the other institutions or communities that we engage. And as we acknowledge that we all have worldviews, one of the contributions that the spiritual communities can make to consciousness change is one of radical humility, is one of exorcising the notion of exclusivist claims to truth, or that I, as a human being, have full knowledge, which, by the way, in my tradition is called idolatry, that if you believe you know the mind of God, you have committed perhaps the worst sin that is possible, that we all know only in part. We need each other in order to fill out the picture of this world in which we live. And more than that, we need to see as our sisters and brothers the animal life, the plant life, the earth as a living being in which we're also in relationship with, so that I hope that one of the things, this dialogical approach that Patrice mentioned, which is so important, that true dialogue leads to us seeing ourselves as one among many other people of different worldviews, one among many of this natural world in which we live, and that we can come to the place of not seeing the other as enemy or as a competitor in this world of nurturing life, of creating resilient and thriving communities, but to enter into an era of cooperation that I hope what we're seeing now with this sort of retrenchment into the old kind of systems of patriarchy, that we are seeing the last gasp of patriarchal institutions holding on desperately to their power, whereas what we are perhaps on the cusp of is that breakthrough of consciousness where we relate to each other in the world in an entirely different way. And I think that is in fact the spirit of the spiritual movements that have become religious institutions, not always reflecting the breadth of those original spiritual movements.
And to get there, we need more dialogue.
Yes.
We need to create the spaces, to expand the tables, and to reach out and go to sit down on the grounds with people where they are, to reach out to where people are, and practice that approach of dialogue in a way that actually helps transforming ways in which people communicate and think about each other or feel about each other, to overcome the grievances eventually, and transforming this into a process of long-term healing, which is essential if we want this increased consciousness to happen.
Beautiful.
Thank you very much. It's almost like, Patrice, you just right on cue to conclude on that. And I hope Laura, Edward, Sharif, and others who have posed questions on the Q&A would find that you get the answers. But in fact, we always, at the Guerrand-Hermes Foundation for Peace, we always said, really, the good answers start with good questions. So what you have shared just now suggests that our worldviews really underpin our spiritual values. And then the question is, how do we integrate these core spiritual values that just mentioned, shared by most faiths and religions, such as love, compassion, respect, Victor talked about humility, dignity, and deep communion with each other, with the spirit. We're not to talk, so, and Victor said we need each other, but Katherine also said, well, in effect, we belong to each other and with other beings in the world. So how might these values be embraced as pillars that can underpin the practice of institutions, global governance towards that systemic peace? And that's maybe we think about, if we just end on Martin Luther King's notion of beloved community. can we actually draw on all these positivity, Katherine said, these strengths, and work together to build a beloved community across boundaries and difference. And I think that with that, it's time for us to conclude this webinar from the panelists. I thank Katherine, Patrice, and Victor for your insightful analysis and contribution. And I'm going to hand it back to DOC, because from the outset, the DOC has already played a special role in bringing religions into dialogue with representatives, academic, governance, and civil societies. And I think this would be the time for the DOC to share your work. And from us, the participants and the moderator, as the speakers and the moderator of this webinar, we thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Heather Brown. I am a research associate and editor at the DOC, and I just wanted to say a few words about the Tunis process. This is an initiative that the DOC launched last year, and our first event was held in Tunis. And the project explores the relationship between Muslim communities and communities of other cultural and religious backgrounds. The Tunis process aims to generate policy recommendations and initiatives that make a substantive and positive contribution to interfaith and intercultural dialogue. So we're really focused on helping to dismantle misperceptions, those exacerbated by xenophobia, ideological extremism, the exclusion of the other, from the grassroots level to international policies. And we're fortunate enough to be partnering with the Al Jazeera Center for Studies, the Guerrand-Hermes Foundation for Peace, the LBH Foundation, and CAICES. So the first event that we had was held in Tunis last year under the auspices of the Tunisian presidency. And the meeting brought together over 30 participants, policymakers, influencers, academics, practitioners from a wide range of backgrounds, which is one thing that actually makes the initiative quite unique. And the first event really focused on the relationship between Islam and Europe. So Arab communities or Muslim Arab communities in North Africa and Muslim communities in Europe, and how Islam impacts Western culture and vice versa. And then the second symposium that we had was held right after the Rhodes Forum, which is the DOC's flagship event. And this was in October of last year. And this event expanded the conversation to also talk about Muslim communities in Central Asia and how they relate to Russia and so forth. And we also spent a great deal of time brainstorming how initiatives can be developed that have a much more substantial impact than just simply talking about change. Because many dominant narratives in both Muslim majority countries and non-Muslim countries just continue to widen the gap between communities and continue to hinder the co-creation of a common future. And it will be really interesting moving forward. I'm sure we'll be holding future events online, perhaps not, but yeah, I would just like to thank everybody in this webinar, because it was really fascinating and raised a lot of really interesting questions to be addressed in the future of the Tunis process. So thank you. And now I would like to hand it over to Alexei Malyshenko, who's the chief researcher at the DOC, to discuss his projects on interreligious dialogue.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And indeed, thank you for the participants. And I want to say a couple of words about our program, which is called Interfaith Dialogue. One of the tasks of this program is to create a special report entitled Religion in Third Decade of Our Century. I think it must be very interesting because we'll try to follow main dynamics of the religion in the society, in the political life, and so on. It's very difficult, I understand, but it's extremely difficult to, let me say, to predict what will have next 10 years. But anyway, it is necessary, because if not, we can miss very, very important problems. So dynamics, dynamics connected with religion. I think that our special report, which we try to prepare, will create with two topics, two mainstreams, let me say. First of all, it's a religion in the society, or let me say, perhaps it could be called religiosity in the society. Yes, it's very, very important. We understand it, and besides, don't forget, when we mention the notion of religion, it means we will speak, and we are speaking about interpretations, different interpretations of religion. So it's useful to understand what religion will mean and means now. Next topic, number 2. It's a, let me say, religion and secular authority or authorities. To my mind, perhaps we must to discuss the problem in which world we live. What I mean, is it a post-secular world or not? To my mind, we live indeed in the post-secular world, and the impact of religion will grow. That's no doubt. It's my private opinion, but still, it's a topic number 2. Number 3, it's a international relationship and religion. Also, perhaps it's a certain exaggeration, but however, I cannot admit the creation of so-called new world without a religious factor. The impact of religion on the political life in general becomes more and more significant, and I don't believe that it will fall down next year. So it's important. Yes. And the last, but not the least, is interreligious dialogue. How they speak to each other. It's a factor. It's a very important factor for the societies, for humanity, and of course for the political life. That's no doubt. So as I told you before, we started preparing special report with four topics, 4 items, and of course 4 chapters. Well, and we invite all the participants of this webinar to participate in this job. We want to finish to do it this year. It doesn't mean that all the materials could be prepared next morning, but anyway, we are waiting for your help, and I hope if we are successful on this way, that will be not bad. And don't forget, only last sentence. We are the Institute of Dialogue of Civilization, and the religion, so the faith, is one of the key factors of such dialogue. I cannot imagine how we can talk, how can we discuss the problem of dialogue between civilization if we ignore some religion. So some religion is one of the key topics of our institute and its special program. Thank you.
Okay, now I'd like to introduce our co-founder and chairman of the board of the DOC, Dr. Vladimir Yakunin. Dr. Yakunin, there you go.
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants? Scherto, it is my personal pleasure to see you and to have you as a moderator of this session. We did a lot together, and I'm very thankful to all the members of this discussion. As Scherto already mentioned, that were very difficult questions. These were very difficult questions to answer. But the major idea of this webinar, and not only this webinar, but the entire work of Dialogue of Civilization since 18 years was to involve, parts of the society, which we call, believers or churches, to be part of the dialogue. And Scherto, you're absolutely correct when you referred to the article in Guardian, and I can tell you that the it was made in 2010, Russian population census, shown that 80% of the Russian population admitted they are Orthodox. It does not mean that they are worshipping, in accordance with the dogma, but they believe they are Orthodox. On the other hand, in Russia, we have more than 190 nations and all Abrahamic religions to be presented. And if we are talking about the influence of this coronavirus 19 on the religious worshipping, I suppose it is something very, very damaging. Why? Ladies and gentlemen, I don't believe in social distancing in terms. Why? Because a man is a social creature. We can call it anti-pandemic distancing, whatever, but not social distancing. In political sciences, to which I belong, we call contemporary society atomized society. So when we are using that kind of terminology, we are enforcing this tendency for atomization. From the point of view of the church, of the religions, I don't trust that, the church can sustain only on the screen or via, some kind of internet communications. On the other hand, the safety, the necessity to survive dictated that churches, mosques, everything were closed for the time being. And we still have to study what kind of influence, and I would say not positive influence, this very period of closure would bring to us. So, as I mentioned, Dialogue of Civilization involves all civilizations, representatives of all civilizations at the table to discuss. And religious leaders are also involved into this Dialogue of Civilizations. And that is the most essential element of our entire work. So thank you for paying attention to this type of the dialogue. Thank you for participating in this webinar. And of course, I'm greatly honored, firstly, to see my old friends and to get the new one. I hope that we will meet not only at this webinar. Thank you very much.